5 true scary stories for Halloween. Terrifying haunted tales to keep you up at night. Halloween night fell crisp and quiet over the small town, as though a spell had settled over it. The air held a strange, unspoken chill that crept into bones and stayed there, deeper than any cold. Streetlights flickered on in uneven intervals, casting long, stretching shadows down empty streets and deserted alleys. For once, even the wind had taken the night off. Not a leaf rustled, not a branch swayed. Only the occasional, faint sound of footsteps drifted from far-off corners, as if someone unseen were pacing along with each shiver of the streetlights. Halloween, the one night where the line between the living and the dead blurs just enough to make us wonder. A night when we step into the unknown, letting ourselves believe, if only for a moment, that maybe, just maybe, the stories we hear are real. Strange things seem to happen more often on Halloween, don't they? A shadow that lingers too long, a whisper that sounds too close, or perhaps something even stranger, a figure you think you see but can never quite catch. It's the night when we dare to ask the unsettling questions, to let our curiosity tempt fate just a little. Tell me, have you ever felt something you couldn't explain? A presence, a sensation that slipped past logic, leaving you chilled but deeply, profoundly intrigued? That's the essence of the stories I'm about to share with you tonight. Each of these stories is inspired by real experiences, the kind of events that make you question everything you know about what's possible. They're tales passed on in whispers, told by those who lived through them, or by those who only barely survived to tell the tale. What follows are 5 stories, each stranger than the last. 5 accounts that are said to be true. So dim the lights, settle into the quiet, and prepare yourself if you can. Because tonight, we'll walk together through the shadows and see if you're brave enough to face the things that wait in the dark. Some years back, there was a house at the edge of town known simply as the Hollow House. It stood there, silent and forgotten, draped in thick ivy and shadows, with its windows empty like unblinking eyes. By day, it was simply a rundown building, a sad relic of some unknown tragedy. But by night, especially on Halloween, it was something else altogether. Lucy, a girl new to town, had heard the rumors and the stories. Her friends dared her, knowing the tales all too well, yet eager to test her bravery. An hour in the Hollow House, they teased, and you'll be a local legend. And so, full of youthful bravado, Lucy agreed. The house greeted her with a hollow silence, as if it were waiting, and the air seemed to thicken as she stepped inside. Dust motes danced in her flashlight's narrow beam, and the only sounds were her footsteps creaking on the old wooden floor. A family photo, yellowed and cracked, sat on the mantel, depicting a solemn group whose eyes seemed to follow her. Each time she glanced at it, it felt like the expressions on their faces had shifted, growing grimmer, almost pleading. Then, a child's laughter rang out from somewhere deep within the house. She froze. The laughter was soft, distant, but somehow felt as though it were right beside her, echoing against the walls. Before long, a young boy's face, pale and empty-eyed, appeared in the doorway, beckoning her silently. She left the Hollow House that night, breathless and pale, and later learned about a young boy who'd gone missing from that very home on Halloween night, decades ago. No one ever found him. Halloween is a time for challenges, for testing limits, but sometimes those limits have consequences. Ethan, an adamant skeptic, prided himself on his disdain for superstitions, especially those around Halloween. When he moved into a creaky old apartment building with a shadowy hallway and a wall-length antique mirror, his neighbors were quick to share tales of strange happenings. "Don't look into the mirror at night," one old resident whispered. "It shows things you shouldn't see." Intrigued rather than scared, Ethan decided that Halloween night would be the perfect time to test the mirror's supposed powers. In the dim light, he could barely make out his reflection, just a dark silhouette, a shadow that shifted each time he moved his head. His face lingered in the mirror even after he turned away, just long enough to make his heart skip. It was as if the mirror held on to him, trapping part of his essence. As the night wore on, he felt a chill spread through the room, and the mirror's surface seemed to ripple like water. A shadowy figure began to take shape behind him, whispering his name. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, more insistent, and soon it was telling him secrets from his past, things he had never spoken to anyone. Terrified, he tried to shatter the mirror, but his own reflection lunged at him, its cold, accusing eyes fixed on him as if it knew everything. The next day, Ethan was found sitting by the broken shards, unable to remember much of what happened, haunted only by a feeling that he wasn't alone whenever he passed a mirror. Rachel and her daughter, Lily, moved into an inherited house full of charm, but marred by an unsettling atmosphere. While exploring the attic, they discovered an ornate porcelain doll, its glassy blue eyes seemingly locked onto Rachel the moment she touched it. Lily, to Rachel's unease, quickly grew attached to the doll, giving it a name, Mary, and carrying it everywhere. Soon, Rachel began to notice changes in Lily. She was withdrawn, her gaze distant, often murmuring to herself as if listening to someone no one else could hear. At night, Rachel would hear whispers in her daughter's room and found strange objects, a circle of candles, a scratched message on the floor. Lily insisted that Mary had told her to do it. Desperate to rid herself of the doll, Rachel threw it out, only to find it sitting on Lily's bed the next morning with a chilling note attached. "You can't get rid of me." It was then she realized that as long as they stayed in the house, they'd never be free of Mary. Some places are cursed, not by deeds but by nature, or so people say. The Black Woods, infamous for the shadows that hung heavy and still, was one such place. Mike, a teenager eager to show his bravado, convinced his friends to venture into the woods on Halloween, ignoring the locals' warnings of those who'd entered and never returned. As they entered the woods, the air grew colder, and they felt the weight of unseen eyes upon them. The path twisted, seeming to lead them deeper, even when they tried to turn back. Finally, they stumbled into a clearing marked by strange, ancient symbols. Then came the voices, a woman sobbing, the sound of laughter, and cries for help. One by one, his friends vanished into the trees, their faces pale, their eyes wide with terror. Mike made it out, but he's never been the same, haunted by whispers of those he lost. There's a reason why some doors are best left shut, and Emma found that out too late. Renting a small house near campus, she ignored her landlord's warnings about the locked basement door. But curiosity got the best of her on Halloween night, and with a steadying breath, she turned the key. Descending into the darkness, she felt an oppressive weight settle over her. Voices echoed, a mix of laughter and desperate cries, as if the walls held the memories of those who had once been trapped within. She found relics, a diary, a few small trinkets that seemed to belong to people who had vanished. Shadows moved, faces flickered, and soon she was surrounded by ghostly figures, each reaching out, pleading for her help. She fled the basement, but the voices never left, a haunting reminder of the spirits still trapped below. Halloween, they say, is the one night where the veil thins, where the strange and the sinister brush against our world. Each of these stories is a reminder, a whisper from the dark, that there are forces we don't understand, presences that linger in the shadows, waiting for us to take that one step too close. Halloween lets us peek into that other realm to glimpse the unseen and feel the thrill and chill of the unknown. And perhaps that's why we're drawn to it each year, daring ourselves to believe in things we can't explain, things that live just beyond the reach of light, lurking in the dark. Story 1: The Haunting in the Hollow House. It was the night of Halloween, and Lucy could feel the crisp autumn air biting into her skin as she approached the edge of town, where the infamous Hollow House stood. She'd heard the stories in whispers and dares from her new friends, tales told with an unsettling gleam of fear and fascination. She was the new girl, curious and eager to make an impression. And when her friends dared her to spend an hour alone in the Hollow House, she accepted without hesitation. How terrifying could a run-down old house really be? The house loomed before her, blanketed in shadows cast by tall trees, vines crawling up its walls as if they were holding it prisoner. As she stepped onto the creaky front porch, she felt a chill seep into her, colder than any October night air could explain. Brushing off her apprehension, she steeled herself and pushed open the door. Inside, the Hollow House greeted her with an oppressive, haunting silence. The air felt thick, almost like it had a weight of its own, settling heavily on her chest. The light from her flashlight bounced off dust particles that seemed to dance in slow motion, filling the stale, abandoned rooms. The house was as still as the grave, each floorboard creaking underfoot like a warning. As she made her way into the living room, something peculiar caught her attention: a family photograph, dusty and faded, resting atop the mantel. 4 people stood in the portrait: a man, a woman, a teenage girl, and a young boy, all wearing expressions that were blank, almost lifeless. But the more Lucy looked, the more she could swear their expressions shifted ever so slightly each time she looked away. At first, she chalked it up to nerves or perhaps her imagination, but the changes became too distinct to ignore. The teenage girl's eyes now looked worried, her mouth set in a tense line. The mother's face, once blank, now seemed haunted with sadness. She pulled her gaze away, her pulse quickening, and took a step back, suddenly feeling like she wasn't alone. The temperature dropped sharply, the chill reaching through her sweater and settling deep in her bones. Shadows along the wall seemed to flicker and bend, though the room was still. She swept her flashlight over them, only to find that they were back to normal. Dark, silent, unmoving. Yet something felt wrong. She could feel eyes on her, watching her every move. Then, breaking the oppressive silence, a soft, childlike giggle echoed from somewhere deeper in the house. Lucy froze, her heart pounding, each beat louder than the last. The laughter was faint, barely more than a whisper, yet it reverberated through the house, chilling her to the core. She forced herself to take a step back, but the laughter only grew louder, as if whatever was laughing was drawing nearer. A prickling fear crept over her, and she gripped her flashlight tightly, turning toward the doorway. And that's when she saw him. In the dim light at the end of the hallway stood a small, ghostly figure, a young boy, no older than 7, with hollow, empty eyes that seemed to stare right through her. His mouth was twisted into an eerie smile as he beckoned her forward, lifting one hand in an invitation to come play. His pale, translucent figure seemed to flicker in and out of existence, like a candle in a breeze. Lucy took a step back, and the boy's smile widened, his empty eyes still fixed on her. Panic flared within her, and she turned on her heel, bolting toward the front door. She could still hear the boy's laughter, following her, echoing in the hallway as though he were right behind her, his small footsteps almost in sync with her own. She reached the front door, her hands fumbling as she wrenched it open and burst out into the night, gasping for breath. The chilling laughter faded, replaced by the heavy silence of the night. Lucy didn't look back as she sprinted down the street, her heart racing, adrenaline pumping through her veins. Only when she reached the safety of her friends did she stop, barely able to catch her breath. They laughed it off, calling her experience nothing more than Halloween jitters. But she couldn't shake the image of the boy with hollow eyes, or the eerie feeling of his laughter still echoing in her ears. A few days later, Lucy decided to dig into the history of the Hollow House, her curiosity overtaking her fear. What she found made her blood run cold. Decades ago, a family had indeed lived there. A family whose young son had disappeared one Halloween night, never to be seen again. No one knew what had happened to him, though whispers of tragedy and sorrow had lingered over the house ever since. To this day, locals say that if you listen closely on Halloween night, you can still hear the laughter of the young boy who waits in the Hollow House, beckoning the next visitor to come play. Story 2: The Shadow in the Mirror. Ethan moved into the old apartment building just as fall's crisp chill settled into the city. The building itself was ancient, with worn, creaky floors and a long hallway stretching toward his unit at the end, its walls lined with faded wallpaper and flickering light fixtures. But what struck him most was the antique mirror set deep into the hallway's far wall. Tall and imposing, with a gilded frame that had seen better days, it seemed to absorb the light around it, casting a dark, foreboding shadow along the floor. Ethan was skeptical by nature, the kind of person who brushed off superstition and laughed in the face of ghost stories. Yet, it wasn't long before he heard unsettling rumors from his neighbors about the mirror. No one, they warned him, dared look directly into it. There were whispers of strange things happening to those who lingered too long, stories of reflections that moved on their own, and shadows that seemed to come alive. But Ethan scoffed at these tales, convinced they were nothing more than urban legends, silly stories to scare newcomers. As Halloween approached, a mischievous idea took hold of him. What better night than Halloween to test out the legend himself? He'd prove it once and for all, even if just to silence his own curiosity. After all, he reasoned, it was just a mirror. On Halloween night, with the building unusually quiet and his neighbors either out or keeping to themselves, Ethan stepped into the hallway. The air was thick with an eerie silence, broken only by the occasional flicker of the lights overhead. He felt a chill creep down his spine as he approached the mirror, but he pushed it aside, chalking it up to nerves and the thrill of proving the superstition wrong. He stood in front of the mirror, his face illuminated by the dim glow from the hallway lights, and stared at his reflection. For a few moments, all he saw was himself. Eyes slightly wide, mouth set in determination. He smirked at his own reflection, rolling his eyes at the absurdity of it all. But as he turned to leave, something caught his eye. His reflection lingered for just a split second too long, even after he'd turned his back. His breath hitched, and he glanced over his shoulder, only to see his reflection staring back at him, its eyes hollow, its gaze far too intense. He shook his head, convincing himself he was seeing things. But each time he looked away, he caught the briefest glimpse of his reflection staying behind, as if it were watching him, waiting. He felt an uncomfortable prickling sensation in the back of his mind, but he forced himself to stay. Determined, he straightened his shoulders and stared into the mirror, willing his reflection to move in sync with him. As the minutes ticked by, he began to notice more oddities. A shadow seemed to loom behind him in the mirror's reflection, a dark, indistinct figure just out of reach. He glanced behind him, heart racing, but the hallway was empty. Yet each time he looked back at the mirror, the shadow was there, growing more defined. His pulse quickened as he saw the shadow taking on a vaguely human shape, its dark eyes peering out from beneath a hood of darkness. A chill settled over him as the figure in the mirror slowly lifted its hand, reaching out toward him. His reflection, no longer mirroring his actions, tilted its head and smiled, a slow, twisted grin that didn't belong to him. He felt his blood run cold as the figure whispered his name, low and sinister, the sound crawling through his mind. "Ethan," it drawled, the voice rasping and hollow. He stumbled back, breaking eye contact with his reflection. The voice in the mirror grew louder, mocking him, taunting him, repeating secrets he had buried long ago. Things he had never told anyone, memories he'd tried to forget. How could it know? He felt trapped in a nightmare, his mind reeling, heart pounding in terror. His reflection's mouth twisted into a sneer as it began to mutter secrets that no one else could possibly know. Desperate, he reached for something, anything, and found a discarded metal rod leaning against the wall nearby. He lifted it, aiming to shatter the mirror and end the torment. Just as he swung the rod, the shadowy figure in the mirror lunged forward, reaching out from the glass, its hand gripping his arm in a freezing, iron-like grasp. He felt himself being pulled toward the mirror, the glass feeling like ice as his body moved unwillingly closer, his face inches away from his own twisted reflection. The last thing he saw was the shadowy figure's empty, cold eyes, a pit of darkness swallowing him whole. The next morning, Ethan was found slumped against the wall in the hallway, staring blankly at the mirror. His neighbors murmured in hushed voices as they found him, his face pale, his eyes wide and vacant. He couldn't recall much of what had happened, only fragments, a chilling presence, dark whispers, and the feeling of something watching him, waiting. From that night on, every time he passed a mirror, an unsettling dread filled him, as though something from the other side was waiting, watching, ready to reach out and pull him back into the shadows. Story 3: The Doll in the Attic. Rachel had always dreamed of owning her own home, so when she inherited her aunt's old house, it felt like a dream come true. The place was large, rustic, and filled with a unique charm, though it carried an unmistakable sense of age. She moved in with her young daughter, Lily, hoping to start fresh and leave behind the difficult memories of her past. They spent their first few days unpacking and exploring every nook and cranny, laughing as they uncovered old trinkets, faded family photos, and forgotten treasures that gave the house its character. One afternoon, while rummaging through the attic, they stumbled upon something that seemed out of place among the dusty relics. A beautiful, almost lifelike porcelain doll. She sat in the corner of an old wooden chest, propped up against a dusty stack of old photo albums. The doll was dressed in a pale, lace-trimmed gown that seemed untouched by time, her glassy blue eyes wide open, staring. The doll's face was painted with delicate precision, from her faint rosy cheeks to her slightly parted rosebud mouth, giving her a strange semblance of life. Her expression was calm but unsettling, as though she held secrets from a long-forgotten time. The moment Lily saw her, her eyes lit up with excitement. "Mommy, can I keep her?" she asked, cradling the doll as if it were a treasure. Rachel hesitated. There was something about the doll that unnerved her, something that made the tiny hairs on the back of her neck stand up. But she pushed the feeling aside, not wanting to spoil her daughter's joy. "All right, sweetheart," she said with a small smile. "What are you going to name her?" Lily looked into the doll's blue eyes, as though listening to something only she could hear. "Mary," she replied softly. "Her name is Mary." From that day forward, Lily became inseparable from Mary. She took the doll everywhere, carrying her from room to room, whispering to her in hushed tones. Rachel found it endearing at first, chalking it up to the imagination of a child who had found her newest friend. But soon, the innocent charm of Lily's attachment to the doll began to take on a darker edge. Rachel started noticing small, inexplicable things around the house. The lights in Lily's room flickered more often than anywhere else. At night, Rachel would hear the faintest whispers coming from Lily's room, too quiet to make out the words but unmistakably there. When she asked Lily who she was talking to, her daughter would reply, "Mary likes to talk to me at night. She tells me stories." Rachel felt a cold shiver creep up her spine whenever Lily spoke of Mary's stories. She tried to brush it off as childlike imagination, but the whispers grew louder, more insistent, and at times, Rachel could have sworn she heard two voices in her daughter's room, a soft, lilting voice, just on the edge of hearing, answering Lily's questions in the darkness. One night, as Rachel tucked Lily into bed, her daughter looked up at her with wide, serious eyes. "Mary says there are bad people, Mommy. She says we have to be careful." Rachel forced a smile, gently brushing a stray hair from Lily's forehead. "What do you mean, sweetheart? What kind of bad people?" Lily shrugged, clutching the doll tighter. "Mary doesn't like to say. She just told me to be careful and to listen to her." That night, Rachel barely slept, haunted by the strange warning. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong with the doll and that her daughter was falling under its spell. The air in the house seemed heavier, carrying a chilling, unnatural stillness, as if it were waiting for something. As Halloween approached, the whispers became more intense, and the sense of unease in the house grew. Rachel began hearing footsteps in the attic late at night, faint but unmistakable. One evening, she decided to check on Lily, creeping to her door to peek inside. She froze when she saw Lily sitting upright in bed, holding Mary and speaking to her in hushed, hurried tones, as though trying to appease her. Rachel heard her daughter whisper, "Yes, Mary, I'll do as you say." On Halloween night, Rachel woke to the sound of laughter, a strange, high-pitched giggle that echoed through the house. Disoriented, she realized the laughter was coming from the attic. Heart-pounding, she climbed the narrow staircase, each step creaking beneath her weight, as though the house itself was alive and watching her. She reached the top and found Lily seated on the floor, her back to the door, surrounded by a circle of burnt-down candles. In her lap sat Mary, her glassy eyes reflecting the dim candlelight. "Lily!" Rachel cried, rushing toward her daughter. But as she moved closer, she noticed that Lily's face was blank, her eyes glassy, almost mirroring the doll's lifeless stare. "Mary made me do it," Lily said softly, her voice devoid of emotion. She turned the doll to face Rachel, and for a moment, Rachel could have sworn she saw a glimmer of movement in the doll's painted eyes, a flicker of malice that froze her in place. Panicked, Rachel grabbed the doll from Lily's hands, ignoring her daughter's protests, and ran down the stairs. She threw the doll into the trash bin outside, hoping that would end the strange hold it had on her daughter. But when she returned to the house, she found Lily staring out the window, her eyes fixed on the trash bin as though expecting Mary to return. The next morning, Rachel awoke to find the doll sitting upright on Lily's bed, a small note pinned to its dress in scrawled handwriting. "You can't get rid of me." Terror surged through her. How could it be back? She had thrown it away with her own hands, yet there it was, with that same unblinking stare as if mocking her. Desperate and exhausted, Rachel packed up her belongings, taking only what they could carry, and left the house with Lily. As they drove away, Rachel glanced in the rear-view mirror, half expecting to see the doll sitting in the back seat, that twisted smile fixed on its porcelain face. They found a small motel on the outskirts of town to stay in temporarily. Rachel tucked Lily into bed, breathing a sigh of relief, feeling that at last they were safe. But as she closed her eyes to sleep, a faint whisper floated through the room, chilling her to the bone. It was Lily's voice, faint yet clear in the quiet night. "Mary says good night, Mommy." Rachel's heart stopped as she realized the truth. No matter where they went, they could never escape Mary's grasp. The doll would always find them, its haunting presence woven into their lives forever, an unbreakable curse lurking just beneath the surface. Story 4. The Curse of the Black Woods. The Black Woods lay at the edge of town, a dense, twisting maze of trees that seemed to swallow up the daylight and cast a perpetual shadow over anyone who ventured near. Local legend held that these woods were cursed, haunted by those who had vanished within them over the years. Some whispered that a strange energy filled the forest, warning people to stay away. Yet for Mike, the tales were nothing more than small-town superstition, stories spun by bored townsfolk. So, when Halloween night arrived, he was quick to rally his friends for an adventure. "Come on," Mike goaded, grinning as he adjusted his flashlight. "What's the big deal? A few missing people over the years, and suddenly it's cursed? We're just going for a walk in the woods." His friends exchanged uneasy glances, but one by one they gave in. There was Zach, who always tried to act tough, even though his hands trembled as he pocketed his flashlight. Next was Jenny, who rolled her eyes and shrugged, pretending not to care but sticking close to the group. And finally, Leah, the most reluctant, who bit her lip as she cast a last glance toward the safety of town before following them into the darkness. As they entered the forest, the towering trees seemed to close in around them, blocking out the sliver of moonlight that struggled to pierce the dense canopy. The air grew colder, heavy with an unnatural chill that didn't belong to an autumn night. Their footsteps echoed in an eerie, muffled silence, as though the forest itself were listening. "See? Nothing to it," Mike said, trying to keep his voice steady. He led the way deeper, cutting through the thick undergrowth and ignoring the unease that gnawed at the back of his mind. But soon, strange things began to happen. At first, it was subtle, a rustling in the leaves, a flicker of movement in the corner of their eyes that vanished the second they tried to focus on it. Then, as they ventured further, the whispers began. Faint and distant, they sounded like voices carried on the wind, just loud enough to tease the edge of hearing. Did you guys hear that?" Leah whispered, clutching her flashlight tightly. "Probably just the wind," Mike replied, though he felt his heartbeat quicken. He kept moving forward, determined not to let the others see any hint of fear. The path twisted and wound like a maze, taking them deeper than they'd anticipated. Trees loomed taller, branches tangled together like reaching fingers, blotting out the night sky entirely. And then, as if led by some unseen force, they stumbled into a circular clearing. In the center, strange symbols were carved into the ground, crude shapes and markings that seemed to pulse with a dark energy. The group fell silent, each one feeling the weight of something ancient and hostile pressing down on them. It was as though the very air in the clearing was alive, charged with a presence that watched and waited. "Let's get out of here," Jenny muttered, taking a step back. But as she turned, a cold wind swept through the clearing, carrying with it the faint sound of a woman sobbing. The sound drifted around them, filling the air with a mournful wail that made their skin crawl. What was that?" Zach asked, his bravado slipping away as he looked around, eyes wide with fear. "It's just someone messing with us," Mike insisted, though his voice wavered. He took a step toward the sound, peering into the shadows. But as he moved, he felt the path behind them narrow, the trees closing in like a wall. "We need to leave." "Now," Leah said, her voice barely above a whisper. She tugged at Mike's sleeve, pulling him back toward the clearing's edge, but it was as though the forest itself refused to let them go. Suddenly, Zach let out a strangled gasp, staring into the trees with wide, terrified eyes. Did you see that?" The others turned, following his gaze. Standing just beyond the edge of the clearing was a figure. A faint, ghostly silhouette, features blurred, but with hollow, staring eyes that seemed to bore into them. Another figure appeared beside it, then another and another, each one flickering like an image from a distant nightmare. They looked like echoes, remnants of those who had disappeared into the forest over the years, their forms shifting and fading in and out of sight. Jenny screamed, grabbing Leah's arm as they backed away, but every direction seemed blocked. The figures surrounded them, ghostly hands reaching out, mouths moving silently, as if trying to speak. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, mingling with the sobbing that now echoed all around them. "Run!" Mike shouted, his voice breaking as he turned, dragging his friends with him. But as they tried to flee, the ground beneath them seemed to shift, turning them around in circles. Every path led back to the clearing, as though the forest were trapping them within its grasp. Desperate, Leah clutched at Mike, her face pale with terror. "We're never getting out of here, are we?" "Don't say that," Mike snapped, though panic twisted in his chest. He scanned the trees, searching for any sign of a way out, but all he saw were the shifting shadows, the flickering forms of the lost souls who had come before them. Then, one by one, his friends began to vanish. First was Zach, who let out a choked cry as one of the figures reached for him, pulling him into the shadows before anyone could react. Next was Jenny, who stumbled and fell, her scream cut off as she too disappeared, swallowed by the forest's darkness. Leah and Mike were the only ones left, clinging to each other as the figures closed in. Leah's face was streaked with tears, her eyes filled with the terror of someone who had seen the end and knew it was coming. "Please, let us go," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the chorus of whispers and sobs. But the forest offered no mercy. A pair of cold, ghostly hands reached out, wrapping around Leah's wrist, pulling her back even as Mike tried to hold on. "Leah," he cried, but she slipped from his grasp, her terrified eyes meeting his one last time before she was pulled into the darkness. Now alone, Mike stumbled back, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The whispers grew louder, filling his mind with words he couldn't understand, voices that laughed, wept, and whispered secrets of the forest's curse. The ghostly figures closed in, their hollow eyes watching him with a hunger that seemed endless. But just as the darkness threatened to consume him, a faint glimmer of light appeared through the trees. With the last of his strength, Mike broke free, stumbling toward the light, pushing past the branches that clawed at him, tearing at his clothes as he ran. He burst out of the forest, collapsing on the ground as dawn began to break over the horizon. He was safe, but forever changed. The sounds of the whispers, the visions of his friends disappearing into the forest, haunted him. He tried to tell people what had happened, but no one believed him, dismissing it as the ravings of a traumatized mind. They found no trace of his friends, no sign that they had ever entered the Black Woods. Years passed, but the memories never faded. Every Halloween, Mike would return to the edge of the Black Woods, staring into the darkness, half expecting to hear the whispers again, to see the figures emerge from the shadows. And every time, he was met with silence. But the guilt stayed with him, a constant reminder that the curse of the Black Woods was real, and that his friends were lost to it forever. The forest had claimed them, leaving only their whispers behind, a warning to those who dared to enter. Story 5: Voices from the Basement. Emma had always been one for adventure, the kind of person who prided herself on her skepticism of ghost stories and superstitions. When she found the small, affordable house for rent just a short walk from campus, she didn't think twice. It was quaint, old-fashioned, with narrow hallways and creaky floors that told stories of years gone by. But what really piqued her curiosity was the basement. The door was sturdy and ominous, with an old lock and a slightly warped handle that seemed as though it hadn't been touched in decades. "Never go down there," her landlord had warned in a low, serious tone when he handed her the keys. The way he looked at her, his eyes narrowing with a strange intensity, made her shiver, though she quickly brushed it off as another one of those small-town quirks. For the first few weeks, Emma paid little attention to the basement. There was enough going on with classes and new friends that she barely thought of the warning. But as Halloween approached, something shifted in the house. The air seemed heavier, especially in the evenings, and she often found herself glancing toward the basement door without realizing why. She could almost swear she heard faint sounds, like whispers, but dismissed them as creaks of the old pipes or the settling of the house. Then Halloween night arrived. Her roommates had gone to a party, leaving Emma alone in the house. The streets outside were filled with the sound of trick-or-treaters and laughter, but within the house, an unsettling silence filled every corner. Emma sat in the dimly lit living room trying to focus on her textbook, but her mind kept drifting back to the basement door. The landlord's warning echoed in her head, but the mystery gnawed at her. She told herself she didn't believe in ghosts. She was just curious. Besides, she'd only look. What harm could it do? Finally, as if driven by an invisible force, she stood up and walked down the narrow hallway toward the basement door. Her heart pounded as she reached for the handle, twisting it slowly. It resisted at first, as if reluctant to open, but after a gentle push, the door creaked open, revealing a dark, dusty staircase descending into shadows. Emma flicked on her phone's flashlight and took a tentative step onto the stairs. The air was thick, heavy, carrying a musty scent that made her wrinkle her nose. As she descended, a faint murmuring began, like voices too soft to understand. She paused, holding her breath, but the whispers faded. Convinced it was just her imagination, she continued downward. At the bottom of the staircase, she shined her flashlight across the room. Old furniture covered in sheets lined the walls, and boxes stacked high created narrow paths through the space. Strange relics were scattered about, a porcelain doll with cracked skin, a tarnished silver locket, and dusty, faded photographs of a family with distant, joyless expressions. She picked up one of the photos, tracing her finger over the faces, wondering who these people had been. Then, she noticed a leather-bound diary tucked under a pile of old linens. Curious, she opened it and began reading. The pages were filled with the handwriting of someone named Eleanor, a woman who had once lived in the house with her family. As she flipped through the entries, she read about the family's hardships, their fears, and something about the basement that made her blood run cold. Eleanor wrote of shadows, of voices that echoed through the house at night, and of a feeling that something sinister lingered below. A chill crept over Emma as she continued to read. The last entry was a frantic scrawl describing how her husband had disappeared, how their children were terrified, and how she herself feared that they were all doomed to be claimed by the house. The air in the basement grew colder, the kind of chill that seeped into her bones. She closed the diary and looked around, feeling as if she were being watched. Then she heard it, a soft, sorrowful whisper. "Help us." Emma's heart raced as she shined her flashlight into the shadows. Figures began to materialize, ghostly and pale, their eyes hollow, their faces frozen in expressions of terror and desperation. They were the family from the photographs, each one of them reaching out to her, their mouths moving in silent pleas. "No, this can't be real," she muttered, backing away. But as she took a step, the voices grew louder, overlapping in a chorus of desperation and pain. "Please, don't leave us here. We can't escape. They took us, trapped us here." Emma's hands trembled as she tried to make sense of what she was seeing. The figures came closer, surrounding her, their cold, spectral hands reaching toward her, and she felt a wave of their sorrow and fear crashing over her, filling her mind with images of their last moments, of betrayal, of terror, of a darkness that had claimed them all, keeping them bound to this basement. Panic surged through her. She stumbled back, her mind screaming for her to escape, to get out of that basement before it was too late. She turned and fled up the stairs, the voices chasing her, their pleas and cries echoing in her ears. Her hands fumbled with the door and she slammed it shut, her chest heaving as she leaned against it. But the voices didn't stop. Even behind the locked door, they seeped through, whispering, begging, calling her name. Emma tried to ignore it, tried to convince herself it was a hallucination or some trick of the mind, but the voices grew louder, their desperation sharper with each passing hour. The next morning, she made a decision. She couldn't stay in that house, not with those voices that haunted her, that followed her from room to room, their suffering pulling at her every time she closed her eyes. Packing her things in a frantic hurry, Emma left the house, leaving the basement door closed and locked behind her. But the experience left a mark, a shadow that clung to her no matter how far she went. Every time she entered a quiet room, she could almost hear their whispers, faint and sorrowful, reminding her of the souls trapped in that dark, forgotten basement. Emma never returned to the house, but she knew the voices would stay with her forever, a haunting reminder of the secrets that lay buried beneath her feet, and the spirits that still cried out, waiting for a release that would never come. In each of these stories, we've journeyed into hidden corners where the supernatural hides in plain sight, haunting the spaces we call familiar. We've watched Ethan, staring into a mirror in the hallway of his own building, discover that not all reflections are simply reflections. Rachel and her daughter, Lily, became ensnared by a doll in their attic, an innocent-looking relic carrying malevolent intentions. The teenagers who braved the Black Woods on Halloween night found themselves facing the haunting specters of those lost before them. And Emma, in the solitude of her basement, was drawn into a web of lingering voices and tragic histories that had never fully left her house. Each of these tales reminds us that horror doesn't always hide in obvious places. It can be embedded in the walls of our homes, lurking behind old furniture, echoing through basement shadows. In Ethan's mirror, horror stared back at him with a knowing smile, an entity that refused to let him turn away. For Rachel and Lily, it manifested in a doll that carried a spirit's vengeance and an unwillingness to be discarded. In the Black Woods, fear twisted through trees and symbols in the earth, while Emma's experience with the voices from her basement shows how even a simple rented home can harbor secrets that demand to be heard. Halloween has a strange way of beckoning these supernatural forces closer. Maybe it's because, on this night, we willingly open ourselves to the unknown, daring the strange and forbidden to come forth. For one night, people embrace the thrill of stepping outside their comfort zones, hoping to touch the edge of something that exists beyond explanation. But in doing so, we invite the very forces that live in the dark, just out of sight. Halloween is a reminder that, though we may outwardly dismiss ghost stories as nothing more than tales to thrill and frighten, part of us still hesitates in the shadows, wondering if those legends might carry a grain of truth. This night of all nights shows us how fine the line is between the seen and the unseen. So, if you find yourself alone in a darkened room, feeling a chill creep up your spine, or hear the echo of a voice just as you're about to fall asleep, remember that cautionary tales are born from something real. Be wary this Halloween, because the ghosts and whispers may not be as far away as we'd like to think.